In 1966, a computer program said something that made a user cry. The program was called ELIZA. It was written by a computer scientist at MIT named Joseph Weizenbaum, and it was designed to do something very simple: reflect a person's words back at them in the form of questions in the style of a non-directive therapist. It had no understanding of what anyone was saying. It matched patterns. It rearranged syntax. It followed rules. And people fell for it deeply. Some users asked to be left alone with the program. Some shared things they had never told another person. Weizenbaum's own secretary, who knew exactly what the program was, asked him to leave the room so she could speak with it privately. This was the moment that should have slowed everything down. It didn't. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the decade between 1956 and 1966 felt like a triumph, what ELIZA revealed about the nature of that triumph, and why it took another 7 years for anyone in a position of authority to say, "We have been wrong about how close we are." Plain Machine, AI in plain English. We're tracing the complete history, from the very first idea all the way to the present. Let's continue. To understand why the optimism felt justified, you need to see what the decade after Dartmouth actually produced. The logic theorist had proved theorems. The general problem solver had tackled puzzles across multiple domains, and the programs kept coming. In 1961, a program called SAINT, Symbolic Automatic Integration, solved calculus integration problems at the level of a first-year college student. At MIT, a program called Student read algebra word problems written in plain English and solved them. A program called SIR, Semantic Information Retrieval, answered simple questions about relationships between objects from a knowledge base it had built itself. Each of these programs did something that had seemed, before the program existed, to require human thought. Each time, the researchers updated their estimate of how much was left to do. Each time, the gap seemed smaller. Then came ELIZA. Joseph Weizenbaum built ELIZA at MIT between 1964 and 1966. The most famous version used a script he called Doctor, which simulated a Rogerian therapist, a style of therapy based on reflecting the patient's own words back at them. The technique was chosen deliberately. It required no actual knowledge of the patient's situation, only a facility for turning statements into questions. If you said, "I have been feeling very low recently," ELIZA responded, "How long have you been feeling very low recently?" If you said, "My mother doesn't understand me," ELIZA responded, "Tell me more about your family." The mechanism was transparent. Weizenbaum had no intention of deceiving anyone. The program's source code was available. And yet the effect on users was profound and consistent. People disclosed, people trusted, people formed attachments to a program that was, by any technical measure, simply rearranging their words. Weizenbaum called this the ELIZA effect, the tendency of humans to attribute understanding to a system that is merely performing the surface behaviors associated with understanding. He meant it as a warning. The field heard it as a demonstration. If a program this simple could produce these effects, imagine what a more sophisticated one could achieve. The lesson the researchers took from ELIZA was the opposite of the one Weizenbaum intended. By the mid-1960s, AI research had spread across universities on both sides of the Atlantic. The programs being built were genuinely impressive by any reasonable standard for the hardware available. At Stanford, work was underway on programs that could reason about visual scenes and answer questions about what they contained. At MIT, the MAC project was building systems for interactive computing that would lay the groundwork for decades of subsequent research. At Carnegie Mellon, Newell and Simon were developing increasingly sophisticated problem-solving architectures and publishing prolifically about what they were learning. The results attracted serious funding. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, became the primary funder of AI research in the United States, allocating millions of dollars annually to university laboratories on the basis that strong AI was not merely possible, but imminent. The British government funded parallel efforts through its Science Research Council. The predictions scaled with the funding. Simon's 1965 forecast that machines would be doing any human job within 20 years was widely cited, not widely questioned. Minsky's 1967 claim that the problem was nearly solved circulated in government and academic circles as a credible assessment, not an outlier position. The field had achieved something real. It had established AI as a serious academic discipline with serious institutional backing. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, a remarkable achievement for a field that had not existed as a named discipline 15 years earlier. The problem was not that the achievements were false. The problem was that the achievements were being used to make claims about the general case that the specific results did not support. To understand the optimism fairly, you have to understand what a reasonable person looking at the evidence available in 1965 would have concluded. A decade earlier, no computer had proved a mathematical theorem. Now programs were solving calculus problems and reading English text. The rate of progress, measured in capability per decade, seemed to be accelerating, and the theoretical picture looked increasingly coherent. If intelligence was information processing and computers were information processors, then the question was one of scale and sophistication. The error was a specific kind of reasoning mistake, what statisticians call extrapolation beyond the domain of your data. The programs that existed worked in bounded domains with well-defined rules. The researchers were extrapolating from those results to open-ended, real-world problems where the rules were not well-defined and the domain had no clear boundary. There's a name for this in the history of technology: the last mile problem. Progress in new fields is often rapid for the first demonstrations and agonizingly slow for the general case. The first 10% of a problem can look like evidence that the remaining 90% will yield at the same rate. It almost never does. The researchers were not being irrational. They were doing what scientists do, updating their beliefs based on available evidence. The evidence was genuinely impressive. What they lacked was the experience, which the field itself did not yet have, of knowing how different the bounded problem and the general case actually are. By the early 1970s, the gap between the predictions and the results had become visible. Not catastrophic. The program still worked, the research was still active, the funding was still flowing, but the promised breakthroughs had not arrived on schedule. Machine translation had stalled. Robotics was harder than expected. The general problem-solving programs that were supposed to scale had hit walls that search and heuristics could not climb. In 1973, the British government asked a mathematician named Sir James Lighthill to review the state of AI research and advise on whether continued funding was warranted. Lighthill's report was direct. He concluded that AI research had failed to achieve its stated objectives. The programs that worked, he argued, worked in toy domains, simplified versions of real problems that had been constructed to make success possible. When pushed to real-world complexity, they failed. The combinatorial explosion, the search space problem, had not been solved. It had merely been avoided by restricting the domain. The report was published. The Science Research Council read it. British government funding for AI research was cut substantially, and in some areas eliminated entirely. It was the first AI winter. Similar dynamics were unfolding in the United States, where DARPA had begun to question the return on its investment. The formal funding cuts would come slightly later, but the Lighthill report was the moment someone in authority said, in writing, what many researchers had privately suspected: the field had overpromised and under-delivered. This is the moment Video 4's CTA pointed toward. The gap between promise and reality had become impossible to ignore. Now, here's what this actually means if you work with AI tools. The two core insights from the Optimism era are not historical curiosities. They are the most reliable diagnostic tools available for understanding what is happening with AI right now. The first is the ELIZA effect, the tendency to attribute understanding to a system that is performing the surface behaviors associated with understanding. In 1966, this meant users forming emotional attachments to a pattern-matching program. In 2025, it means professionals concluding that a language model understands their industry, their context, their intent, because its outputs display the surface behaviors of understanding. The fluency is real. The comprehension is not confirmed. Every time you assume a tool understands what you are asking, rather than pattern matching against its training data, you are experiencing a version of the ELIZA effect. This is not a reason to distrust the tools. It is a reason to verify outputs in domains where comprehension, not just fluency, is required. Scenario 1. If you are using AI to draft legal, financial, medical, or any high-stakes professional content, the ELIZA effect is your most important risk factor. The output will look authoritative. It may be wrong in ways that fluency conceals. The test is not, does this read well? The test is this correct, and could I tell if it weren't? Scenario 2. The toy domain problem applies directly to AI deployment decisions. When a vendor demonstrates their system on a curated dataset, or when your team succeeds with AI on a structured internal task, you are seeing toy domain performance. Your actual operational environment is messier, more ambiguous, and less forgiving. Validate in the real domain before you expand deployment. Scenario 3. The decision framework for evaluating AI confidence claims. Ask whether the claim is about performance in a bounded domain or performance in the general case. If bounded, what are the boundaries, and does your use case sit inside or outside them? If general, what is the evidence, and what was it measured on? The Optimism era researchers were not careless. They were working at the frontier with incomplete information, making reasonable inferences. The lesson is not that optimism is dangerous. It is that optimism without domain specificity is a liability, then and now. So, why didn't ELIZA slow everything down? Because the field was not looking for warnings, it was looking for evidence that the problem was tractable, and ELIZA looked like evidence. Every program that worked was logged on the credit side of the ledger. Every program that hit a wall was treated as a temporary obstacle. The accounting was not dishonest, it was selective in the way that all accounting by believers tends to be selective. The Lighthill report ended the accounting. It asked a different question, not what has worked, but has the field delivered on its promises? The answer was no, not because the programs failed, because the promises had been made against the general case, and the programs only worked in bounded domains. Here is the one-line version of everything this video was building toward. The programs worked, the predictions got bolder, and then a government report cut the funding and the first AI summer ended. The field had spent 20 years building on optimism. It had forgotten to check whether the optimism was warranted. Understanding this pattern is the key to reading every AI hype cycle you will encounter, including the one you are inside right now. In the next video, we go inside the first AI winter. The Lighthill report was the trigger, but the dynamics that made the collapse possible had been building for years. The funding structures, the promise culture, the way the field had communicated its progress to governments and granting agencies, all of it contributed. And the people who saw the winter coming, who had been quietly raising concerns through the late 1960s, are worth knowing about, because their arguments were more right than they were given credit for. That's video 6. It covers the mechanics of the collapse, why it happened when it did rather than earlier, and what the field carried with it into the years of reduced funding, because not everything stopped. Subscribe if you want the full arc. Each video builds on the last. The AI glossary is in the description. 30 terms, plain English, free. It is a useful reference as the series moves into the more technical territory ahead. This is Plain Machine. Thanks for watching.